Vote SNP to make Scotland Tory-free. That's the message that the First Minister Humza Yousaf is placing at the heart of his party's campaign for the upcoming general election. He outlined some of his thinking when he addressed SNP activists on Saturday in Perth.
A straight fight between the SNP and the Tories that I have no doubt that the SNP is going to win. But the prize for Scotland isn't just this constituency. We have the opportunity to ensure that Scotland is Tory-free. Not a single Tory MP left in Scotland. Delegates, that is definitely a prize worth fighting for.
The SNP's election messaging is proving to be quite contentious. We questioned the party's Westminster frontbencher, Richard Thomson. Richard Thomson, is making Scotland Tory-free the right strategy for the SNP?
I think it's the objective that very many voters in Scotland would want. Look, I represent a constituency in the northeast of Scotland, very proud to do so, and my main challengers are the Conservatives. But what we have to remember is that every seat in Scotland that the Conservatives hold, the SNP are breathing down their necks in second place. But in another 20-odd seats across Scotland, it's the Tories that are in second place to the SNP. So it's quite clear when you look at the maths that only a vote for the SNP is what will remove Tory MPs from Scotland.
But I'm asking you if it's the right strategy, because let's face it, your longest serving MP, Pete Wishart, doesn't think it is.
Well, I'm not an avid follower of everything that Pete says on Twitter, although, like the First Minister, I do love him to bits. But no, I mean, certainly, I think most people in Scotland are focused on the objective of making sure that they have MPs in Westminster that will stand up for Scotland. And
I spoke to Jim Sillars about it a couple of weeks ago, and he was appalled by it as well.
Well, certainly the objective is we want to make sure that we don't have any Tory MPs in Scotland, a bit like in 1997. But look, it's not enough for the Tories to lose in Scotland. In order to make sure Scotland wins, we need to make sure we've got a strong voice at Westminster that's prepared to speak up for the interests of the people of Scotland, whether that's on the cost of living crisis or whether it's on international issues like the appalling situation in Gaza. On these issues, it's SNP MPs who've been making their voice heard, making their presence felt. And that is what this is about, making sure that we have MPs at Westminster after the next election who can be relied upon in all circumstances to stand up for the values of the people in Scotland.
But whether making Scotland Tory-free is a strategy or just a slogan, isn't it insulting 700,000 Scottish voters? Douglas Ross says that you're treating them with open contempt.
No, I'm respectful of all views, but at the end of the day, when the votes are counted, I don't want to see Conservative MPs elected in Scotland. And I think it's a little bit hypocritical of Mr Ross to make that argument, given he's currently trying to round up as many people as he can to try and engineer the reverse outcome for SNP MPs.
So it's just electioneering?
Certainly, I think from his criticism. But here's a challenge to Mr Ross. If he really wants to make sure that politics in Scotland is being fought cleanly, then perhaps he could give an undertaking not to campaign with any of the £15 million of the donations that have come to the Conservatives.
And I asked them about that last week.
That Diane Abbott should have a harm come to her.
Do you hate the Tories?
No, I absolutely do not. I have many people in the Conservative Party that I admire, that I would consider friends, people who vote for them. But come this election, I think that the government that we've had in Westminster over the last few years has been appalling. It's dragged Scotland out of the European Union against its will. It's inflicted policies on us like the rape clause and the benefit cap. And if we want to see a change and be sure of actually getting that change, to make sure that those arguments are heard, then only a vote for SNP representatives can be relied upon to make sure that that voice is heard.
But doesn't this plan just completely ignore the fact that it's really Labour that's breathing down your neck in most of the country? Maybe not your seat, but most of the rest of Scotland.
Well, in large parts that's not the case, but let me go back to that
point. I said right earlier, across
Colin,
central Scotland.
Like I said earlier, Colin, it's not enough for the Tories to lose. Scotland also has to win. And I think that you cannot rely on Labour MPs. We've never been able to rely on them in the past. We won't be able to rely on them in the future to stand up for the values of most people in Scotland when it comes to things like tax, when it comes to things like ending austerity, or even if if it comes back to something like getting Scotland and the rest of the UK back into the European Union. Basically, the Labour Party under Sir Keir Starmer has swallowed their Conservative agenda whole, and it's only SNP MPs that can be relied upon to stand against that after the next election. Richard Thomson, thanks for joining us in Scotland tonight. This evening we were joined in the studio by the preeminent elections expert, Professor Sir John Curtice. John Curtice, does this Tory-free with the SNP message make sense as a campaigning strategy for the election?
It makes sense for a bit of Scotland, but not for a very large part of Scotland. The 6 seats that the Conservatives will be trying to defend, together with the one that Lisa Cameron, one who's defected from the SNP to the Conservatives in East Kilbride. I mean, those 6 seats are seats where the SNP are the principal challengers to the Conservatives, and even in East Kilbride, they'll probably start off looking like the principal challengers to the Conservatives. But the trouble is, it's not the Conservatives who are the principal challenger to the SNP's current dominance of Scottish politics. The truth is that is now the Labour Party, and to that extent, at least, what Humza Yousaf needs at the end of the day is a rallying cry that tries to persuade people inside the Central Belt, where most of these Labour SNP contests are, to stick with the SNP rather than switching to Labour. Now, the truth said, there's a sense in which his stance is somewhat more credible than that the Labour Party is saying. The Labour Party is also saying, you need to vote for us in order to ensure that the Conservatives can't form the next government. Well, the truth is, it isn't Labour who can unseat the Conservatives in the seats the Conservatives currently hold. And if you take the view, if you take the SNP at their word, that the SNP would not be willing to help sustain a minority Conservative administration, in a sense, the whole argument about what's the best way to vote to ensure that the Conservatives don't form the next government is largely irrelevant, because the truth is, in most of Scotland, it probably won't make any difference as to whether or not the seat goes to the SNP or the Labour Party, as to whether the Conservatives can remain in office or not. And to that extent, at least, I think both the SNP and the Labour Party are, shall we say, putting forward messages that are at least open to scrutiny.
Because at the Scottish Conservative conference in Aberdeen just a few weeks ago, Douglas Ross was talking about Nat Zero. It seems like a continuation of the SNP and Conservative feuding that we've seen since 2014, really, which has served them both quite well in some elections, hasn't it?
Well, indeed. I mean, I think you have to bear in mind that although the Conservative Party constantly complains that the SNP are focusing too much on independence, and this is the reason why, in their view, things like schools and the hospital service, etc., aren't working terribly well. If you listen very carefully, Conservative spokesmen do seem to be very, very keen to talk about independence, i.e. they are very keen to attack it. And to that extent, at least, yes, they are keen on polarising Scottish politics, because virtually everybody who votes Conservative is somebody who wants Scotland to remain inside the Union. Virtually everybody who votes for the SNP is somebody who wants Scotland to leave the Union. The Labour Party, of course, is the one party that attempts to bridge that divide, and is the one party that, in fairness, has some success in bridging that divide. Indeed, the reason why the Labour Party are breathing down the SNP's neck, well, in part, for the same reasons as south of the border, they've taken votes off the Conservatives, but crucially, around 1 in 6 or so of current supporters of independence are saying they're going to vote Labour rather than the SNP. So although the Labour vote is predominantly a unionist vote, it does have a significant minority support from Yes supporters, and it is that support that is enabling Labour to breathe down the SNP's neck. They're only about 1 point on average in the opinion polls, and that would probably be enough to ensure that Labour, rather than the SNP, ended up with slightly more seats if that were to the position in the autumn.
So despite that kind of polarisation on the constitutional question, you think there is a move that the SNP is losing voters to Labour, particularly presumably in central Scotland, where, as you say, they're breathing down their neck, as we saw in Rutherglen?
Well, I think the honest truth is what the strategy the SNP need is a strategy that persuades those people who still believe in independence, which is nearly a half the country according to the polls. There's been no decline in that number, to persuade those folk that they need to vote for the SNP rather than vote for Labour. It's not clear to me that that is the strategy they've managed to find. Yes, they can make it clear to people by voting for us. There's certainly no chance that they will allow the Tories to remain in office, and they can counter Labour in that way. But they also have to persuade people that having the SNP at Westminster with strong representation is going to make a difference. Now, the honest truth is...
It's a tough election for the SNP, isn't it?
It is a tough election, but bear in mind, so, one of the things they probably should be pointing out is, look, if you want Scotland's voice to be heard via the nationalists, ensuring that the SNP are still the third largest party in the House of Commons is potentially quite important, because the Democrats, if the Conservatives do badly down south, may well be breathing down the SNP's neck as the third largest party. So there are arguments...
Everyone's breathing down the SNP's neck, aren't they?
Well, sure. But the point is, there are arguments the SNP could use, but they need to be arguments that are essentially focused on yes supporters who are not backing the party at the moment, and that is partly about trying to say to them, oh, look, you can vote for us safe in the knowledge that indeed this is not going to help the Conservatives remain in office. But also, I think the honest truth is they've also got to start to be able to defend their record in government and to create a vision for what they're going to do in government more effectively than they've managed to do over the last 12 months.
John Curtice, thanks for joining us in Scotland tonight.